This is Bruce, part of a series of jewelry boxes that I make called Spirit of the Woods. Normally I pick out two unique boards, one for the front and one for the sides. And it's the character and the size of these boards that really informs the whole design process. So this was an experiment in using ordinary materials, pine and construction lumber from the home center. See what would happen without that kind of influence. Now, since my materials are inexpensive, I figure I may as well go big. But I'm probably going to have to ship this to a customer, and there's a limit to how big of a thing I can reasonably ship. And I only have certain sizes of shipping boxes. So I can actually work backwards from the size of the shipping box, out here, to the packing material, the size of the slabs, a space in between, finally to the size of the cabinet. With that in mind, I could go looking for the most interesting piece of 1x pine that I could find. And this is what I came up with. I thought about making some deeper drawers by keeping the knots intact, but I decided to cut them in half. Now what I should have done when ripping the drawer fronts was to leave the last one long, so I could cut it to fit the actual size of the cabinet once that was made, but I got carried away. I had to glue one piece back together, and then I could resaw. I could have done the resawing before ripping, but why make a wide resaw if you don't have to? I could do the front as a standard book match, but I find when it's a horizontal book match and the pieces are kind of short, it usually looks better if you flip one set over. Often you can get the grain flowing from one side into the other, and it helps if you cut them a little bit long so you can shift them in relation to each other. I know better, but I decided to run the drawer fronts through the planer, and all but one of them made it through fine. And I'm missing a chunk out of this one. Now, one possible fix would be to cut the whole knot out and try to fit another knot into it. I would probably then have to do the same thing to the drawer below it to get them to match. I figured first I would just try figuring a triangle cut from a knot and see how that looked. After straightening the rough edges, I marked out the shape and made my cuts. The result is certainly not perfect, but it really doesn't show in the finished piece unless you go looking for it. Since the drawer front overlaps the side of the cabinet, and this is what stops the drawer when you close it, I wanted to reinforce that glue joint. So I drilled a couple of holes with a Forstner bit on the back side and fit a piece of scrap. You'll never see this, so I wasn't too worried about making it look nice. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the construction of the cabinet, but I've let the lumber dry out and acclimate to my shop for at least a few weeks. And as most pine boards from the home center are going to do, this one has cupped. But it's pine, so hand planing is easy. Now, this is where my tendency to go into projects without a real plan, working on two similar projects at the same time, really comes to bite me. My intention was to overlap the drawer fronts over the entire cabinet. But I don't have enough height to do that. And even if I did, I cut the outer drawer fronts such that I couldn't possibly get a usable drawer. So I'm going to have to inset the drawers on the top and bottom. But I can't do that on the sides because if I cut them, it's going to go right into the knot or right next to the knot. And that's just not going to look good. So it's going to have to be inset on the top and bottom and overlap on the sides. It ends up being easy to accomplish because all I have to do is rip the front edge of the sides and leave the top and bottom alone. But I do need a stopped rabbet on the back side for the back panel. Once the cabinet is assembled, I can square up the corners of the rabbet for the back panel. Normally I would put the bottom of the drawers inside of a groove just above the bottom pin of the dovetails. But since these drawers are so shallow, I decided I would just make a rabbet on the bottom so that the drawer bottom will be flush with the bottom of the drawer. Then I give the maximum space inside of the drawer. That's going to be plenty strong for a jewelry box. Before I make the rabbet, I want to make sure that my drawers don't have any twists to them, because it's going to be really difficult to get rid of that with the drawer bottom being flush with the bottom. So I just use my table saw as a flat reference and see whether they rock or not. And if they do, then I'll mark those corners. If you can take the whole stack of drawers and it doesn't rock, then you know that everything is flat. I make the rabbet on the router table, and rather than square off all the corners, on all of these drawers, I'm going to take a shortcut and knock off the corner of the bottoms. That leaves a little bit of a gap in the drawer, but the drawer lining, the way I do that, is going to cover that up, and it's not going to affect anything at all. But if I had been working with fancy materials, I probably wouldn't be going this route. My drawers are different sizes, and the tolerances have to be pretty high on the spacing of them, so I work my way out from the bottom, cutting each groove for the drawer slide individually. Because I was careful in how I spaced the drawers, I don't have to be as careful about how I glue the drawer fronts onto the drawers. I can just glue them all flush with the bottom and know that they're all going to be pretty close. I did end up with one drawer that was sitting high, so there's almost no gap at the top and a larger gap at the bottom. There's two ways I could go about fixing that. One would be to remove material from the top of the drawer slide. I have this miniature shoulder plane that is useful for this kind of thing, but it doesn't quite fit with this drawer spacing. So the second option is to remove material from the top of the groove in the drawer. And to do that, I'm using a side rabbet plane. And I find this plane really difficult to use, but in pine, it works pretty well. There's also a drawer or two where the drawer front doesn't quite sit flush against the cabinet on one side. And that's probably because the drawer wasn't perfectly square. So to fix that, I'm making the groove on the opposite side a little bit deeper. And that'll let the drawer go in further on that side. For the side panels, that was really where I needed to come up with something different from the way I normally go about things. I couldn't just get some 2x12s or whatever and just slap them on there. It wasn't going to look good. But I figured I could rip some 2x lumber into thin strips and do a bent lamination to create something with some character to it. So I cut lots and lots of narrow strips and sent them all through the drum sander. I wasn't worried about getting them perfect. I wanted to do an edge treatment on all those strips so that it wouldn't just be a flat surface. You would see all those individual strips. And I suppose a round over would have worked, but I wanted it to have more character than that. So it would look sort of natural, even though it was assembled out of all these little strips. So I used the edge sander and just sort of moved them randomly across it at different angles and with different amounts of pressure. Then I cut the form, and my first attempt at bending them cracked one of them, so it was a little bit too aggressive of a curve. I could have soaked the strips in water to make them more flexible, but there was a lot of these to do, and I can only bend about 6 or 7 of them at a time in the jig. And so to soak them and then clamp them in the jig and wait for them to dry out and then repeat that over and over again would have taken forever. So I just went for the glue right away. I tried to apply only enough glue so there wouldn't be a whole lot of squeeze out. Some squeeze out was unavoidable, and rather than wait for that to dry, I wiped it off while it was wet, because I figured there would be no way I would be able to get in there to get rid of it once it was dry. I used one side of the bending form on the fence of my crosscut sled to square it up. The way that I normally connect the rails to the side slabs is with pocket holes. And there's a little piece on the rail that covers up the pocket hole. That wasn't going to work here because the surface of the side isn't flat, so I can't just butt the rail up against. So I really had no choice but to make a mortise. So once the rails were glued onto the cabinet, I clamped the sides in place and traced around them. I couldn't really get a good line with a marking knife or a pencil. It was just sort of an approximation of where the rail was going to be. So my solution was to make a template the same size as the end of the rail, and I would locate that on my lines. And so with that clamped in place, I could just butt my chisel up against the side of that template to score out the lines. Then I worked it down to being flat so that I could drill in the center of the drill bit wouldn't wander around without having something to bite into. And then I just cleaned out the rest. And it went together with a little persuasion. I'm really not crazy about the look of pine as it ages, so I stained the drawer fronts and the cabinet. I did something a little bit different for the sides. First I put a coat of shellac, and then I painted it, and then wiped off the excess with a damp rag. That really highlighted the roughness of the surface. I used paint rather than stain here because I figured the paint would cover any glue squeeze out between the strips better than stain would. It was then a tedious process of going back and looking for spots that didn't get paint in them. And finally I used epoxy to glue the rails into the mortises, because I wasn't too confident in the quality of my mortises in the pine. I really love the way this turned out. I actually like it better than Abner. A lot of that is because I think the design lends itself better to being vertical than horizontal. If you would like to purchase Bruce or Abner, if they're still available, there will be a link down in the description to my Etsy shop. I guess we'll see which one of them sells first.